After my wife passed away, her children cornered me in my own kitchen and said we are taking the estate, the business, and absolutely everything else. My lawyer begged me to fight them in court. I told him to draft the surrender papers and give it all to them immediately. Everyone thought grief had finally broken my mind. At the final hearing, I signed away my entire life. My stepchildren smiled in absolute triumph until their lawyer read the second document I slid across the table, and the color completely drained from his face. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth. I stood at the granite island of my kitchen, letting the scalding water run over my calloused hands as I washed the crystal glasses one by one. Through the heavy oak doors, the muted hum of my wife Evelyn's funeral reception echoed in the sprawling living room. I could hear the clinking of expensive silverware and the hollow, sympathetic chatter of people who cared more about the catered food than the woman we had just buried. I preferred the quiet of the kitchen. I preferred the simple, repetitive task of scrubbing plates. It kept my mind from focusing on the empty chair at the dining table. I am Gordon Pierce. I am 72 years old, and for the last 40 years I built a life of quiet stability. I never cared for the country club memberships or the luxury cars Evelyn enjoyed. I was a man who preferred faded flannel shirts and the smell of diesel engines. But I loved her, and I accepted the life she wanted to build, including the 2 children she brought into our marriage. The heavy kitchen doors swung open violently, hitting the wall with a loud thud. The noise shattered the fragile peace I had managed to carve out for myself. Justin walked in first, followed closely by his sister Valerie. They bypassed offering any condolences entirely. Justin was 42 years old, wearing a custom-tailored suit that I knew for a fact he could not afford on his current salary. Valerie was 38, draped in a pristine white trench coat, looking around my kitchen with barely concealed disgust, as if she were already calculating the resale value of the appliances. Neither of them looked like people who had just buried their mother. They looked like predators who had finally found the gate to the enclosure left open. Justin marched straight to the kitchen island and slammed a heavy manila folder onto the wet marble counter, stopping exactly an inch from my coffee mug. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands, slowly looking from the folder to his arrogant face. I asked him what he was doing. Justin adjusted his silk tie and smiled a smile entirely devoid of any warmth or grief. He told me it was time to talk about the future, now that the pleasantries were out of the way. He said they had found a newly updated will signed by Evelyn just days before her passing. According to Justin, the document left this house the personal estate accounts and 100% of the operational control of Pierce Midwest Freight directly to her blood children. He stood there puffing his chest out as if he had just conquered an empire. He looked me right in the eye and demanded that I hand over the keys to the company headquarters by Monday morning. He told me it was time for the real professionals to take over and bring the company into the modern era. Valerie stepped forward, crossing her arms tightly. She coldly informed me that I had exactly 30 days to pack my belongings and vacate the house so it could be listed on the market. She complained that the house was 50 years old, the plumbing was outdated, and she already had a developer willing to pay top dollar for the 70 acres it sat on. She told me I would be much more comfortable in a retirement community with people my own age. I did not shout. I did not throw the glass I was holding. I did not defend my mind or the home I had paid for with 4 decades of sweat. I simply looked at the son and daughter I had helped raise since they were children, noting the absolute certainty in their eyes. They truly believed I was nothing but a lucky carpenter who had ridden their mother's coattails to success. I looked at the legal seal on the folder and asked them quietly if they were absolutely sure this was the path they wanted to take. Justin laughed. It was a harsh, grating sound. He told me I had no choice in the matter, and that my days of playing CEO were permanently over. He told me to start packing my bags because the moving trucks would be scheduled immediately. I simply nodded. I told them I understood, and thanked them for the visit. My calmness clearly unsettled them, but their greed quickly overrode their confusion. They turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving the folder on the counter. An hour later, the guests finally cleared out. The caterers packed up their trays, and the heavy front doors locked shut. The house was entirely empty and suffocatingly quiet. I walked into my home office, a room Evelyn rarely entered, and locked the door behind me. I did not pour a drink, and I did not sit down to weep. The time for mourning had been violently interrupted. It was time to work. I picked up the phone and called Mr. Wallace, my corporate attorney for the last 25 years. When I explained the situation to him, Wallace practically shouted through the receiver. He was absolutely furious. He declared that Evelyn was heavily medicated on painkillers during her final days and that the will Justin produced was a blatant case of coercion and elder abuse. Wallace insisted we could file an injunction by tomorrow morning, freeze the estate and tie the fraudulent will up in probate court for a decade if necessary. He begged me to let him destroy them legally. I told Wallace to hold on and remain silent on the line. I sat down at my heavy wooden desk and opened my laptop. I logged into the company's internal server. Justin and Valerie thought I was a dinosaur who barely knew how to send an email. They did not know that 30 years ago, when we first digitized the dispatch routes, I wrote the foundational architecture for the logistics software myself. I bypassed the flashy main dashboard that Justin loved to monitor and accessed the hidden, unvarnished operational ledgers. I needed to see the exact state of the empire before I decided how to defend it. What I found in the shadows of the accounting software shifted the entire landscape of the battle. I began tracing a series of irregular corporate disbursements routed through our maintenance accounts. The numbers were staggering. Over the last 3 years, Justin had been quietly leveraging the freight company's operational credit line. He had been siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars out of the logistics budget and funneling it into a series of shell LLCs. I traced the routing numbers directly to his failing tech startup. He was using the lifeblood of my trucking company to fund his lavish lifestyle and his disastrous business ventures. The operational company was bleeding cash rapidly. Justin was $3 million in the red, and he was using Evelyn's falsified will to seize total control of the company before the upcoming quarterly audit could expose his massive embezzlement. I read the numbers aloud to Wallace over the phone. I heard my lawyer gasp on the other end of the line. Wallace immediately shifted his strategy. He urged me to use this concrete proof of embezzlement to completely obliterate Justin in criminal court. He said we could have Justin arrested for corporate fraud before the weekend was over. But I sat in the quiet of my office staring at the glowing screen. I realized that suing them would only pause the bleeding. It would initiate a messy public legal war that would drag Evelyn's name through the mud and leave the company vulnerable to competitors. I realized that Justin did not want to run a freight company. He wanted a limitless piggy bank to save himself from his own incompetence. I made my decision. I told Wallace to do the exact opposite of fighting. I instructed him to stand down and not contest the fraudulent will. I told him to draft the unconditional surrender papers immediately. I ordered him to give them the house, the personal accounts, and the operational company without a single objection. Wallace went dead silent on the phone. When he finally spoke, his voice was trembling with disbelief. He thought grief had completely fractured my mind. He warned me that if I signed those papers, I would be handing over a multi-million-dollar infrastructure to a thief. He warned me that I would be left completely destitute, with nothing to my name but my old rusted truck and the clothes on my back. I told him I understood the consequences perfectly and hung up the phone before he could argue further. I stood up from my desk and walked to the master bedroom. I pulled a single canvas duffel bag from the top of the closet. I did not pack the expensive watches Evelyn had bought me over the years, or the tailored suits I wore to her charity galas. I packed 5 faded flannel shirts, 3 pairs of heavy denim jeans, my steel-toed work boots, and my toiletry kit. I was leaving behind the entire illusion of the luxury life I had never truly wanted. As I zipped the bag shut, my cell phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from Justin's wife, Monica. It was a link to a website with a message that read, "I found some affordable assisted living facilities on the outskirts of town that accept basic social security. You should start making calls tonight." I stared at the sheer audacity of the message. They had not only plotted to steal my life's work, but they were actively mocking my impending poverty. They believed they held all the cards because they believed I was a weak, grieving old man. They did not understand that by forcing me out of the operational seat, they were voluntarily chaining themselves to a sinking ship. I turned off my phone, grabbed my duffel bag, and walked out the front door, locking it behind me for the final time. The trap was now fully in motion, and they were sprinting directly into it. The smell of burnt diesel and cold rain hung over the dispatch yard on Monday morning. I stood on the loading dock at 6 o'clock, with a mug of black coffee in my hand, listening to the deep rumble of 30 engines idling in the damp air. This was the heartbeat of Pierce Midwest Freight. I knew the sound of every single truck on that lot. I knew which transmission needed a rebuild just by the way the chassis vibrated against the cracked concrete. I had hired most of the mechanics when they were barely out of high school, and now they were grandfathers themselves, sending their own kids to college on the wages we paid. It was an ecosystem built entirely on mutual respect and hard labor. That fragile piece shattered at exactly 7:15. 4 matte black luxury utility vehicles rolled past the guard shack, ignoring the security clearance protocol. They did not adhere to the 5-mile-per-hour speed limit. They drove straight across the wet asphalt, forcing dock workers to jump out of the way, and parked directly in the reserved loading zones blocking the freight bays. Justin stepped out of the lead vehicle. He wore a sharp navy suit and a silk tie that belonged in a corporate boardroom rather than a working freight yard. Valerie followed closely behind him, adjusting a designer scarf, as if the very air of the mechanic's bay offended her senses. Behind them came Monica, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the oily pavement. But they did not come alone. 4 men in tactical black uniforms stepped out of the remaining vehicles. They were private security contractors. They immediately crossed their arms and formed a tight protective perimeter around my stepchildren. Finally, a man I had never seen before emerged from the last car. He wore a slick gray suit and carried an oversized leather briefcase. He had the hungry, calculating eyes of a man who made his living dismantling other people's lives and selling off the parts. They marched up the metal stairs, heading straight for the main dispatch floor. I threw my coffee cup into a trash bin and walked inside to meet them. The moment they crossed the threshold, the room fell completely silent. The dispatchers stopped typing on their keyboards. The mechanics wiped their hands on dirty grease rags, slowly stepping out of the garage bays to watch the spectacle unfold. The man in the gray suit stepped forward and cleared his throat loudly. He announced himself as Arthur Blackwood, a senior corporate attorney representing the new executive board. He did not offer his hand in greeting. Instead, he unclasped his heavy briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound in red tape. He spoke at a high volume, ensuring every single employee in the room could hear his words clearly. He stated that effective immediately, all operational control assets and executive authority of Pierce Midwest Freight were entirely transferred to Justin and Valerie. He held up the court orders citing the updated will and the emergency probate rulings they had pushed through a friendly judge over the weekend. Justin walked past his lawyer and stood merely inches from my face. He turned his back to me, looking out at the sea of my loyal employees to make his grand announcement. He declared that the dinosaur era of the company was officially over. He told the men that new management was taking over to modernize the aging fleet, cut unnecessary overhead, and trim the dead weight from the payroll. He turned his eyes back to me, radiating pure, arrogant triumph. He demanded my master keycard. He stated loudly that I had no legal right to stand on the premises and that I was currently trespassing on his private commercial property. I looked at him, staring into the eyes of a boy I had fed and clothed for 30 years. I felt the familiar primal urge to put him in his place, to remind him exactly who built the roof over his head. But I remembered the hidden ledger I had audited the night before. I remembered the $3 million he had secretly siphoned from the operational budget to cover his own personal failures. I remained completely silent. My absolute silence seemed to infuriate his wife. Monica stepped forward, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. She looked me up and down, taking in my faded red flannel shirt and my scuffed leather work boots with utter disgust. She told the crowded room it was pathetic that a man my age still dressed like a common-day laborer. She sneered that my late wife, Evelyn, was always embarrassed by my refusal to look like a real executive. She then turned to the private security guards standing near the doorway. She instructed them in a cold, demanding voice to physically escort me to my truck. She told the guards to search my pockets before I left the building, to make sure I did not try to steal any office supplies or company property on my way out. The sheer cruelty of the insult echoed across the silent dispatch floor. Behind me, I heard the heavy, sharp clatter of a steel wrench hitting the concrete. Mac, my lead mechanic, stepped out from the shadows of the garage bay. He was a massive man with oil-stained hands and a fierce loyalty I had relied on for 3 decades. Mac pointed a heavy, calloused finger at Justin and told him he had exactly 3 seconds to get his people out of the building before the mechanics threw them out by force. Half a dozen drivers stood up from the break room tables, moving aggressively toward the security guards. The tension in the room spiked to a dangerous boiling point instantly. The private security men reached for the batons on their belts. Physical violence was mere seconds away. I raised my right hand into the air. I did not speak a single word, but the gesture was enough. Max stopped dead in his tracks. The angry drivers halted their advance. I looked at the men who had bled for this company alongside me and gave them a single, slow nod. They understood the silent command. This was not the time to fight. I reached into my front pocket and pulled out the heavy plastic master keycard that granted access to every door vault and server in the building. I did not hand it to Justin. I simply dropped it on the linoleum floor, letting it clatter at his expensive leather shoes. Justin sneered down at the piece of plastic, but he did not bend down to pick it up while I was watching. He instructed Blackwood to notify the local police precinct that I was formally and permanently banned from the commercial property. I turned my back on all of them and walked out the glass doors. The private security guards followed me closely, their hands resting on their belts, marching me down the metal stairs and across the wet asphalt of the shipping yard. I walked toward my 10-year-old rusted pickup truck parked near the outer security fence. I did not look back at the people whispering behind me. I opened the creaking door, climbed into the worn driver's seat, and turned the key. The engine sputtered to life with a familiar rugged growl. As I pulled the heavy gear shift into drive, I looked up through the rain-streaked windshield. The main administrative building towered over the yard. There on the second floor, looking down through the expansive glass window of my former corner office, stood Justin. He had already moved behind my massive mahogany desk. He raised a ceramic cup of coffee towards me in a mock salute portraying a victorious king admiring his newly conquered empire. He truly believed he had won the war. He believed he had successfully stripped me of my life's work, my dignity, and my future, leaving me as a broken, destitute old man. He had absolutely no idea that he had just fought tooth and nail to assume total legal ownership of a rapidly sinking ship. He did not know that by forcefully taking the operational company, he had just volunteered to absorb a massive, fatal mountain of corporate debt. I shifted the truck into gear and drove out the main iron gates. The tires splashed heavily through the deep puddles as I merged onto the highway, leaving the empire completely in his hands. I headed towards a cheap roadside motel on the bleak edge of the county line where the real strategic work would begin. The first steel jaw of the trap had successfully closed perfectly around their ankles. The rain was still coming down in heavy sheets when I pulled my rusted truck into the cracked asphalt parking lot of the Starlight Motel. It was a $60 a night establishment sitting right on the bleak edge of the county line. The neon sign outside my window buzzed with a relentless flicker, casting a harsh red glow through the thin curtains. I grabbed my canvas duffel bag from the passenger seat, walked into room 112, and locked the deadbolt behind me. The room smelled of stale smoke and cheap industrial cleaner. The carpet was worn thin, and the bed sagged in the middle. I threw my bag onto the mattress and pulled out my laptop. I set it down on the wobbly laminate desk in the corner of the room. I did not sit there to wallow in self-pity or mourn the loss of my corner office. I sat down to work. I plugged the computer into the peeling wall outlet and opened a secure encrypted browser. Justin and Valerie thought they had just stripped me down to the bone. They thought a piece of paper signed under duress and a pair of private security guards gave them the keys to a kingdom. They lacked the patience and the intellect to understand the true architecture of the castle they had just invaded. 10 years ago, I saw the rot of greed taking root in my stepchildren. I watched Justin bankrupt his first business venture by spending his investors' money on custom-tailored suits and imported cars instead of paying his vendors. I saw how Valerie treated the waitstaff at restaurants, demanding free items because she felt entitled to the world. I knew the day would eventually come when they would look at my life's work and see nothing but a bank account waiting to be drained. So I spent 2 years quietly restructuring my entire legacy with my lawyer, Mr. Wallace. I executed a legal severance that Justin was far too arrogant to ever discover. Pierce Midwest Freight, the company Justin had just hostilely taken over, did not own a single physical asset. It was nothing but an operational shell company. It did not own the 70 acres of land it sat on. It did not own the massive concrete shipping warehouse. It did not even own the tires on the 30 trucks currently running freight routes across the state. Every single physical asset required to run that business was legally leased, and the entity they leased it all from was a completely private blind holding trust registered under the name Ironclad Holdings. As I typed my master password into the secure portal, the screen illuminated my face in the dim red light of the motel room. I am the sole director and absolute owner of Ironclad Holdings. Justin had seized the wheel of the ship, but he had absolutely no idea he was renting the engine directly from me. I opened the live financial feed for the operational accounts. Since my name was still technically on the legacy banking registry, until the probate cleared entirely, I had a front row seat to their financial decisions. I wanted to see exactly how long it would take for their arrogance to override their common sense. I watched the numbers refresh on the screen. It took Justin exactly 4 hours to start destroying the company. A high-priority notification flashed across the top of my screen. A pending wire transfer for $240,000 had just been initiated. The payee was a high-end European auto dealership located in the wealthiest district downtown. Justin and Valerie were buying themselves matching luxury utility vehicles on the company credit line. They were celebrating their hostile takeover by instantly indebting the business before the ink on the court order was even dry. I stared at the transaction, feeling a cold, calculated satisfaction. They were doing exactly what I needed them to do. 10 minutes later, a second alert chimed through the cheap laptop speakers. A $75,000 non-refundable deposit was routed to the Grand Plaza Hotel. I clicked on the transaction details. The memo line read, "Corporate Rebranding Gala." Justin was throwing a massive opulent party to announce his ascension to Chief Executive Officer. He was planning to pour imported champagne for his country club friends, using the exact operational funds required to pay our diesel fuel suppliers by the end of the week. He was attempting to rewrite history and erase my name from the company letterhead by throwing a party he could not afford. I sat back in the creaking wooden chair and watched the cash reserves bleed out in real time. Justin was acting like a lottery winner instead of a logistics manager. He was burning through the liquid capital so fast, he was completely blinding himself to the foundational mechanics of the business he claimed to run. He only cared about the title and the prestige. He never once bothered to read the balance sheets or audit the vendor contracts. If he had, he would have noticed the massive recurring expenses categorized under equipment and land usage. I poured myself a glass of tap water from the bathroom sink and returned to the glowing screen. Justin was spending millions he did not actually have to impress people who did not actually care about him. He was completely oblivious to the financial cliff approaching rapidly in the dark. In exactly 5 days, the automatic monthly lease payments for the warehouse, the 70 acres of land, and every single truck in the entire fleet would automatically hit the Pierce Midwest Freight accounting department. When those massive invoices bounced due to his reckless spending and insufficient funds, the trap I had built 10 years ago would violently snap shut. By halting his own cash flow, Justin was about to hand me the absolute legal right to repossess everything. The rain was still coming down in heavy sheets when I sat in the dim light of the motel room, listening to the relentless hum of the highway outside. The wobbly laminate desk barely supported the weight of my laptop, but it was all the command center I needed. Through the encrypted portal, I had full visibility into the financial arteries of Pierce Midwest Freight. The liquid reserves were draining at a terrifying speed. Justin had authorized the purchase of the luxury vehicles and the catering for his extravagant rebranding gala. But those expenses were just vanity. The real hemorrhage was his desperate attempt to cover the massive debts from his failing tech startup. He had creditors circling him like vultures, and the operational cash flow of my freight company was not enough to satisfy them. He needed a massive injection of capital immediately. He needed millions, and he needed it before the end of the week. I watched the digital footprints as Justin made his next predictable move. He decided to liquidate the most valuable physical asset he believed he owned. He reached out to a high-end commercial real estate developer in the city center. He wanted to sell the primary shipping warehouse and the 70 acres of surrounding industrial land. It was a facility easily worth $50 million on the open market. Justin was so backed into a corner by his tech debts that he was actively trying to arrange a quiet off-market cash sale for pennies on the dollar just to save his own skin. He brought the developers into my former corner office. I could perfectly picture him sitting behind my mahogany desk, offering them imported coffee and boasting about his new executive authority. He was ready to sign away 4 decades of my sweat and labor just to clear his own personal ledger. But Justin had never bothered to read the foundational paperwork of the empire he stole. I received a notification from the county clerk, automated registry, followed by a forwarded email from the developer's lead agent. The agent had pulled the preliminary title report to draft the letter of intent. I imagined the exact moment the agent slid that piece of paper across the desk to Justin. The blood must have completely drained from his arrogant face. The agent calmly informed Justin that Pierce Midwest Freight did not hold the deed to the warehouse. The company did not own the loading docks, the maintenance bays, or the 70 acres of prime industrial land. The agent pointed to a single line item on the official county record. The property was exclusively owned by a private blind trust called Ironclad Holdings. Pierce Midwest Freight was nothing more than a tenant. The spike in activity on the internal company servers told me everything I needed to know about Justin's reaction. He was in a state of absolute blind panic. He tore through the digital accounting archives, searching for the name Ironclad Holdings. He demanded the master files from the chief financial officer. He finally located the central commercial lease agreement. I remembered sitting in a quiet law office 10 years ago, drafting every single clause of that document. I knew a day would come when Evelyn's children would try to dismantle the company for parts. I made sure the armor protecting my life's work was completely impenetrable. Justin read the terms of the master lease and discovered the horrific truth of his new kingdom. Every single month, Pierce Midwest Freight automatically wired $150,000 in commercial lease fees directly to this anonymous holding company. For access to the land, the buildings, and the entire fleet of trucks, the operational company paid a massive premium. Justin realized in that moment that he did not own a multi-million-dollar logistics empire. He was merely renting a very expensive illusion. He could not sell the warehouse to the developers. He could not leverage the physical assets for a bank loan. He was trapped in a financial vice, and his tech creditors were still demanding their money. Humiliation and rage are a dangerous combination for an entitled man. Justin reacted with the predictable arrogance of someone who had never been told no. A smart executive would have immediately contacted his corporate attorney to analyze the lease structure and negotiate terms. Justin did not call his lawyer. He believed he was the smartest man in the room. He stormed out of his office and went straight to the accounting department. I watched the internal communication logs as his frantic emails lit up the server. He sent a company-wide directive to the finance team demanding an immediate and total stop payment on all outgoing wire transfers to Ironclad Holdings. Justin assumed this phantom landlord was just some outdated tax shelter set up by a foolish old man. He firmly believed he could simply starve the anonymous trust of capital, drag them into a protracted civil court battle, and bully them into signing over the deeds. He thought he was playing hardball. He thought he was showing the entire office what a ruthless modern executive looked like. He believed he was retaining $150,000 in the operational account to float his sinking tech company for another week. I sat perfectly still in the creaking wooden chair of the motel room. The red neon sign outside flickered against the peeling wallpaper, casting long shadows across the floor. A sharp chime echoed from my laptop speakers. A high-priority alert flashed across the screen. The scheduled monthly lease payment of $150,000 had been officially blocked by the sender. The funds were withheld. The transfer was canceled. I did not smile. I did not cheer or celebrate. I simply opened the master contract file on my desktop and read the specific enforcement language I had authored a decade ago. By intentionally halting that specific monthly payment, Justin had unilaterally violated the core financial covenant of the commercial lease. He had committed a direct and material breach of contract. He thought he was saving himself from immediate financial ruin. He had absolutely no idea that he had just armed the penalty clauses buried deep within the agreement. He had willingly stepped onto the landmine and handed me the exact legal weapon required to systematically dismantle his entire life. The trap was no longer just a quiet setup waiting in the dark. The trigger had been pulled, and the countdown to his absolute destruction had officially begun. I sat at the peeling laminate desk as the heavy rain continued to assault the single-pane window of my cheap motel room. The digital clock on the battered nightstand glowed bright red, displaying 8 in the evening. Justin was currently standing in a grand ballroom, pouring imported champagne for local politicians and country club elites he desperately wanted to impress. I opened a blank legal document on my laptop. I did not need an expensive corporate attorney to draft this specific notice. I had spent 40 long years learning the exact ruthless language of commercial logistics. I typed out a formal 7-day cure or quit demand under the stark black letterhead of Ironclad Holdings. The terms I dictated were absolute and unrelenting. The operational company had intentionally missed its scheduled monthly lease payment. I demanded the immediate wire transfer of the $150,000 base rent, plus a staggered penalty fee of $500,000 for the deliberate breach of contract. I added a singular devastating clause to the bottom of the page. If the requested funds were not cleared in the trust account, within exactly 168 hours, Ironclad Holdings would legally and immediately repossess every single truck, trailer, and piece of heavy machinery currently operating under the Pierce Midwest banner. I saved the document onto a secure flash drive and walked down to the motel lobby to print it behind the front desk. I placed the thick stack of warm papers into a heavy manila envelope. I did not rely on standard mail delivery. I called a private courier service located in the city center that specialized in highly discreet priority deliveries. I paid them $300 in cash with very specific and unyielding instructions. The courier was to walk directly into the Grand Plaza Hotel ballroom, bypass the security detail, find the man wearing the most expensive suit acting like he owned the entire building, and hand the envelope directly to his chest. I wanted Justin to open that legal envelope while the professional photographers were snapping pictures. I wanted him to feel the cold steel of reality close tightly around his throat, right in the middle of his crowning arrogant achievement. I returned to my quiet room, locked the deadbolt, and waited in the shadows. 2 hours later, my prepaid cell phone vibrated violently against the wooden desk. It was a long text message from Mac, my fiercely loyal lead mechanic. He had been forced to attend the lavish gala simply to represent the floor workers and provide a fake image of company unity. Mac's message was brief, but it painted a remarkably perfect picture of the chaos I had just unleashed. He told me a courier wearing a soaked rain jacket had walked straight onto the polished dance floor and shoved an envelope into Justin's hands. Mac detailed how Justin arrogantly tore it open, expecting a congratulatory message from a vendor. He read the first page, and the color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost standing under the glittering crystal chandeliers. Justin dropped his crystal champagne flute, shattering it loudly across the pristine marble floor. He grabbed Valerie tightly by the arm and dragged her aggressively out of the ballroom, leaving their confused, wealthy guests staring after them in absolute stunned silence. The expensive rebranding party was effectively destroyed before the main course was even served to the tables. The following morning, the resulting financial fallout reached the freight headquarters like a massive tidal wave. I meticulously monitored the internal corporate communications through my secure backdoor server access. Justin and Valerie had frantically summoned their slick corporate lawyer, Mr. Blackwood, to the main office before the sun had even crested the horizon. I watched the digital access logs as Blackwood desperately pulled the holding trust master lease agreement from the encrypted company archives. I knew exactly what the panicked lawyer was telling them in that closed-door meeting. Blackwood was staring directly at the lethal penalty clauses I had meticulously constructed a decade ago. He was explaining to Justin that Ironclad Holdings possessed an airtight, bulletproof contract. There were absolutely no hidden loopholes to exploit. There were no friendly grace periods to beg for. Blackwood was warning his arrogant clients that if they did not pay the phantom landlord the massive penalty fees, immediately the entire operational fleet would be legally seized and locked down by Friday afternoon. Justin was completely trapped in a cage of his own making. He had already recklessly burned through the liquid cash reserves to cover his failing tech startup debts and to fund his lavish, unnecessary party. He had absolutely no money left in the operational accounts to cure the massive breach he had voluntarily initiated just a few days prior. They desperately needed capital to survive the week. They needed an emergency war chest to hire aggressive litigators and tie Ironclad Holdings up in a prolonged, messy court battle. But traditional commercial banks move incredibly slowly. They require extensive financial audits and pristine credit histories before they release funds. Justin had completely destroyed the operational company's credit rating in less than a single week of gross mismanagement. No legitimate financial institution in the state would lend him a single dime. I watched the banking feeds in real time as Justin frantically submitted commercial loan applications and was instantly rejected by 3 different major lending banks. The walls of reality were closing in on him at a terrifying speed. Panic breeds profound, terrifying stupidity. Justin and Valerie quickly realized they could not use the failing business to secure the necessary funds. They needed a massive, clean collateral asset to leverage immediately. They turned their greedy, desperate eyes toward Evelyn's personal estate. They turned their sights toward the sprawling home I had meticulously maintained and cared for over 30 years of marriage. By early Wednesday afternoon, a new critical alert flashed across my laptop screen. It was a prioritized notification from the county property registry. Justin and Valerie had bypassed the traditional regulated banking sector entirely. They had sought out a predatory private equity firm known entirely for issuing extremely high-risk, high-interest bridge loans to desperate clients. These ruthless shadow lenders did not care about corporate audits or business plans. They only cared about securing hard physical collateral they could easily liquidate. Justin and Valerie applied for an emergency $5 million cash injection to save their sinking empire. To secure that money, they committed blatant and reckless bank fraud without a second thought. Evelyn's expansive estate was still technically locked deep in the legal probate process. The house and the surrounding 70 acres were not legally cleared to be heavily encumbered, sold, or leveraged until the final court hearing was officially completed. But Justin and Valerie were drowning, and they did not care about the law. They willfully falsified the asset declarations on the loan applications. They claimed absolute unencumbered ownership of the property and the primary residence. They forged the preliminary transfer deeds to satisfy the private lenders, aggressive, greedy underwriters. They pledged the entire family estate as the sole collateral for the $5 million loan. They eagerly signed away their mother's legacy at an exorbitant 30% interest rate just to get the cash deposited into their frozen accounts by Thursday morning. I sat in the dim motel room watching the fraudulent lien permanently attach itself to the public property registry. They had taken the bait with spectacular precision. They truly believed the $5 million would save them from total ruin. They believed they could use that borrowed money to hire an army of ruthless lawyers and crush the anonymous landlord threatening their truck fleet. They had absolutely no idea that their fraudulent loan was the final definitive nail in their own coffin. They had just committed a major federal financial crime out of pure, unadulterated desperation. By leveraging the house illegally, they had exposed their personal assets to complete and total annihilation. While they waited for the fraudulent funds to clear the operational reality of Pierce Midwest, freight began to collapse around them. Word quickly leaked through the dispatch floor that the primary leases were not being paid. The mechanics who relied on a stable company for their livelihood staged a massive walkout. The veteran drivers refused to take their rigs onto the highway, fearing the fuel cards would bounce at the truck stops. The company began losing Tier 1 shipping contracts overnight. Clients who had trusted me for decades pulled their accounts the moment they realized Justin was defaulting on basic operational expenses. Justin was drowning in a sea of his own incompetence. Looking for a convenient scapegoat, he immediately blamed me for his failures. He convinced himself that if he could somehow force me to sign away my final spousal survivorship rights, he could completely sever my legal ties to Evelyn's estate, liquidate the corporate brand, and escape with millions before the authorities caught wind of his massive bank fraud. I watched from the safety of my shadows as he dispatched his private security thugs to scour the county and track down my exact location. They were digging a hole so incredibly deep the dirt was already caving in over their heads. They had handed me the exact legal weapon I needed to destroy them permanently. All I had to do now was wait patiently for their oxygen to run out completely. News travels through a freight yard faster than a brush fire. It did not take a week for the mechanics to realize something was fatally wrong. It took less than 48 hours. Mac, the lead mechanic, had spent 30 years listening to the subtle rhythms of diesel engines, but he was equally attuned to the rhythm of the front office. When the fuel vendors started calling down to the garage demanding cash on delivery, Mac knew the operational accounts were running on fumes. We had always operated on net 30 payment terms, a professional courtesy built on decades of absolute financial trust. For a vendor to suddenly demand immediate cash meant our credit accounts were officially frozen. Then the whisper came down from the accounting department. The monthly property and equipment leases had been intentionally blocked by the new management. Justin had essentially stopped paying for the very concrete they were standing on and the tools they held in their hands. Mac did not organize a formal union vote. He did not draft a list of grievances. He simply wiped his grease-stained hands on a rag, threw his heavy wrench into his toolbox, and pulled down the massive corrugated steel doors of the primary maintenance bay. The deafening sound echoed across the yard like a thunderclap. Every other mechanic on the floor immediately followed his lead. They packed their tools, locked their bays, and walked out past the bewildered administrative staff. They were working men who survived on reliable paychecks, and they refused to sink with a ship captained by an arrogant thief. Without mechanics, the trucks do not run safely. Without trucks, the freight sits rotting on the loading docks. The veteran drivers who were already furious about my public eviction saw the closed garage bays and instantly understood the assignment. They parked their massive 18-wheelers in a deliberate, jagged blockade across the main shipping gates. They dropped their ignition keys into a plastic bucket laid on the break room counter and walked off the property in a silent, unified mass. The lifeblood of Pierce Midwest Freight completely froze in a single afternoon. The massive shipping yard that usually buzzed with relentless, chaotic energy fell into a dead, eerie silence. I sat in the quiet gloom of my motel room, watching the dominoes fall through my laptop screen. The client portals began lighting up with urgent cancellation notices. Our Tier 1 manufacturing contracts, the massive corporate accounts I had spent decades personally cultivating, required absolute reliability. When our trucks failed to arrive at their designated loading zones, the clients did not wait for an excuse or an apology. In the logistics business, a missed delivery window costs factories millions in halted production. They pulled their accounts overnight and awarded them to our hungriest competitors. The empire I had spent 40 years building was burning to the ground in a matter of hours, and Justin was sitting right in the center of the inferno. He was utterly drowning in his own manufactured catastrophe. I could easily picture him pacing the floor of my former corner office, watching the yard empty out below him in absolute disbelief. He screamed at the remaining dispatchers, demanding they force the drivers back to work. He threatened to fire men who had already quit. He threw coffee cups against the wall and cursed my name to the ceiling. But the financial rot was not just confined to the freight yard. It was actively spreading and infecting his personal life with ruthless efficiency. Across town, his wife Monica was experiencing her own terrifying reality check. She had spent the morning browsing a high-end designer boutique, completely oblivious to the chaos unfolding at the headquarters. She brought $5,000 worth of imported silk dresses and expensive leather handbags to the pristine glass counter. She casually handed the cashier her Platinum Company credit card, expecting the usual subservient smile. The cashier swiped the card and frowned. The terminal beeped a sharp, glaring decline. Monica snatched the card back, demanding they run it again, blaming a faulty machine or a bank error. The second swipe produced the exact same humiliating result. Her face flushed with anger as she pulled out a personal card tied to Justin's tech startup. Declined. She tried a joint checking account card. Insufficient funds. The cashier's polite smile dissolved into an expression of cold judgment. Monica was forced to abandon the designer clothes on the counter and walk out of the boutique empty-handed. Burning with an intense, furious shame under the watchful eyes of the other wealthy patrons, she called Justin from the parking lot, screaming into the phone, demanding to know why her money was suddenly frozen. Justin could not give her a coherent answer, because he refused to accept the reality of his own utter failure. An arrogant man will never look in the mirror to find the source of his problems. He will always look for a convenient scapegoat. Justin looked out the window at the silent, dead freight yard, and he blamed me. He convinced himself that I had somehow poisoned the well before I left. He believed I had orchestrated the strike and sabotaged the vendor relationships out of pure spite. His mind frantically searched for a way to salvage his crumbling situation and maintain the wealthy illusion he had promised his wife. He knew the operational company was bleeding out rapidly, but he believed the Pierce Midwest brand name, the corporate shell, and the remaining liquid assets from Evelyn's personal estate were still worth a substantial amount of money to the right corporate liquidator. He believed if he could just package the hollowed-out company and sell it to a massive national conglomerate, he could still escape with millions, pay off his suffocating tech debts, and maintain his lavish lifestyle. He began making desperate phone calls to corporate brokers trying to arrange a fire sale, but there was a massive legal roadblock standing firmly in his way. Evelyn's estate was still deeply entangled in the probate process. Despite the fraudulent, coerced will Justin paraded around the house, I still held fundamental spousal survivorship rights under state law. Until I legally signed a comprehensive and absolute waiver relinquishing every single claim to her estate and the company, he could not liquidate the brand or authorize a corporate sale. The brokers refused to touch the assets without a clean, uncontested title. Justin desperately needed my signature on a binding legal document, severing me completely from the family assets. He needed me to erase myself from the legal record. Justin did not intend to ask politely. He did not send his slick corporate attorney to negotiate fair terms or offer a settlement. He was a desperate, cornered animal whose entire identity was collapsing, and he resorted to the only tactic he understood: brute force and intimidation. He decided to send a physical message to ensure I understood exactly who was in charge. The rain had finally stopped, but the night air remained thick and suffocatingly humid. I was sitting at the wobbly laminate desk in my motel room drinking a lukewarm cup of bitter black coffee. The red neon light from the Starlight Motel sign flickered rhythmically against the peeling wallpaper, throwing strange, distorted shadows across the small room. I heard the deep, aggressive rumble of heavy engines pulling into the cracked asphalt parking lot right outside my window. The tires crunched loudly against the loose gravel. I did not need to look through the thin curtains to know exactly who had arrived. I closed my laptop securely and stood up from the creaking wooden chair. Two matte black luxury utility vehicles idled directly outside room 112, their bright headlights cutting through the darkness. 4 men stepped out into the damp night air. They were the exact same private security contractors Justin had used to escort me off the commercial property on Monday morning. They wore tight, tactical black uniforms and moved with a deliberate, heavy aggression meant to inspire immediate fear. They did not knock politely on the door. They slammed their heavy fists against the cheap wooden frame, making the entire wall shake on its hinges. They shouted my name through the cheap siding, demanding I open the door immediately. They had come to collect a signature, and they fully expected a terrified, broken old man to drop to his knees and give them exactly what they demanded, just to make the nightmare stop. I took a slow, deep, steadying breath and walked calmly toward the door, ready to welcome the monsters inside. The heavy wooden door of room 112 rattled violently against its cheap metal hinges. The pounding was not the polite, hesitant knock of evening housekeeping. It was a rhythmic, heavy thud designed specifically to project immediate physical intimidation. I remained seated at the wobbly laminate desk, watching the surface ripples in my lukewarm coffee mug with every single strike against the door. A thick, cream-colored envelope was shoved roughly under the door gap, scraping harshly across the frayed carpet. I did not move to pick it up. I knew exactly what it contained, and I knew exactly who had sent it. My prepaid cell phone illuminated the dark corner of the room. Justin's name flashed brightly across the cracked digital screen. I let it ring 3 distinct times before I pressed the green button and held the plastic device to my ear. I did not offer a polite greeting. I waited in the silence. Justin's voice bled through the tiny speaker, dripping with a frantic, arrogant venom. He told me his security contractors were standing in the cold rain right outside my door. He demanded that I open the thick envelope, sign the enclosed legal waiver, and hand it directly back to his men immediately. He did not bother attempting to mask his sheer desperation. He explained that the document was a total, irrevocable renunciation of my spousal survivorship rights. It was the absolute, final legal thread tying me to Evelyn's estate, and by direct extension, the operational framework of Pierce Midwest Freight. Justin needed that specific legal thread completely severed tonight. He needed my signature to officially bypass the lengthy probate court delays, allowing him to liquidate the corporate brand to his eager buyers by the end of the week. I stared at the white envelope resting on the dirty floor. I told him quietly that I would absolutely never sign a binding legal document under the threat of cheap physical force. Justin let out a harsh, desperate laugh that echoed terribly through the phone. He told me physical force was the absolute least of my current worries. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of pure, calculated cruelty that proved he was truly devoid of a soul. He stated that if I refused to sign the waiver tonight, he would schedule a major press conference tomorrow morning. He threatened to drag his own mother's immaculate legacy through the absolute mud. He claimed he had already paid a disgraced physician a massive sum of cash to draft a retroactive medical report. This fabricated report would explicitly state that Evelyn was suffering from severe advanced dementia during her final years. He promised to launch a massive, aggressive public relations campaign, framing me as a manipulative predator who legally took advantage of a sick, highly vulnerable woman. He was entirely willing to publicly humiliate the memory of the woman who gave him life just to secure his own financial escape route and cover his failing tech debts. A cold, profound, absolute rage settled heavily over my shoulders. It was not a fiery, impulsive anger that makes men shout and break things. It was the quiet, freezing fury of a man who realizes his enemy possesses absolutely no moral boundaries whatsoever. Evelyn had built her reputation on charity and community service. Her name was the only pristine thing left in this entire ugly battle. Justin genuinely thought he was holding a sharp knife directly to my throat by threatening her memory. He had absolutely no idea he was simply sharpening the exact blade I was about to use to destroy him permanently. I set the phone down on the desk, leaving the line completely open. I walked slowly across the worn carpet and bent down to retrieve the heavy envelope. I did not break the wax seal. I reached up, unlocked the heavy deadbolt, and pulled the motel door wide open, facing the cold, biting night air. 3 massive men stood shoulder to shoulder on the wet concrete walkway. They wore black tactical gear, clearly meant to project absolute authority and immediate violence. The largest of the 3 men took an aggressive step forward, invading my personal space, attempting to force me backward into the dim room. I did not take a single step back. I stood perfectly still in my faded red flannel shirt, looking directly into his dark eyes, with a terrifying, unblinking calm. I had spent 40 consecutive years managing hardened dock workers, violent union disputes, and volatile diesel mechanics. I knew exactly how to handle men who relied solely on cheap physical intimidation to earn their paychecks. I looked at the lead guard and told him quietly that if he took one more step toward my doorway, he would permanently lose the ability to walk back to his luxury vehicle. The sheer absolute certainty radiating from my voice made the massive man freeze completely mid-step. He looked closely at my face, saw the total absence of fear, and instinctually stepped backward, retreating into the damp, falling rain. I lifted the phone back to my ear while maintaining intense eye contact with the 3 nervous men in the parking lot. I spoke directly to Justin through the receiver. I told him his hired muscle had miserably failed to impress me. I told him I would never sign a crumpled, unverified legal document in the damp doorway of a $60 a night motel room. Justin began to scream hysterically through the phone, threatening the catastrophic press conference again. I cut his tirade off completely, refusing to let him speak another word. I told him I would give him exactly what he wanted, but it would be executed strictly on my terms and in the broad light of day. I demanded a formal binding mediation on the public legal record. I required the official presence of a sworn judicial mediator and my own legal counsel. I laid out the exact parameters of his victory. I told Justin that if he arranged the formal hearing for tomorrow afternoon, I would sit at the mahogany table and officially sign away absolutely every single legal right I possessed to the freight company and his mother's estate. I promised him total, absolute operational ownership placed permanently on the public record without a single financial caveat or lingering clause. I promised him the absolute entirety of Pierce Midwest Freight. Justin went completely dead silent on the phone. The sheer suffocating desperation in his mind instantly overpowered his native suspicion. He simply could not believe how easily I had apparently folded under pressure. He automatically assumed his vile threat regarding his mother's medical history had successfully broken my spirit. He could not comprehend that a man might surrender a multi-million-dollar empire simply because a larger trap was waiting. He eagerly and frantically agreed to every single one of my terms. He promised to have his corporate lawyer reserve the central mediation room at the county courthouse by exactly 2 o'clock the next day. He arrogantly told me to bring my favorite pen and warned me not to be late to my own funeral. He hung up the phone, entirely convinced he had just executed the greatest tactical victory of his entire life. I looked at the three confused security guards standing awkwardly in the cold rain waiting for their orders. I tossed the unopened envelope directly at their heavy boots. I told them to return to their desperate boss and inform him I would see him in court tomorrow. I shut the motel door firmly and locked the heavy deadbolt with a loud metallic click. I walked back to my wobbly desk and looked at the glowing laptop screen displaying the financial ledgers. The trap was no longer just set and waiting. The heavy steel doors were now officially locked from the outside. Justin had just eagerly scheduled his own financial execution, fully believing he was planning a grand coronation. I picked up my phone and dialed Mr. Wallace, telling my panicked lawyer to prepare his absolute best briefcase for tomorrow afternoon, because the slaughter was finally ready to commence. The bell above the glass door of the Silver Diner chimed softly, cutting through the low hum of the late morning rush. I sat alone in a cracked vinyl booth at the very back of the restaurant. The smell of burnt coffee and fried bacon hung heavy in the damp air. Outside the window, the relentless rain had finally slowed to a steady gray drizzle washing the grease and grime down the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. I held a thick ceramic mug of black coffee between my hands, feeling the heat seep into my tired bones. I wore the same faded canvas jacket and worn denim jeans I had been wearing since Justin initiated his hostile takeover. To anyone else in the diner, I looked like just another forgotten old man trying to stretch a $2 cup of coffee into an hour of shelter from the cold. But beneath the worn exterior, my pulse beat with the steady, calculated rhythm of a metronome counting down to an explosive finale. Mr. Wallace walked through the diner entrance exactly 10 minutes early. He was a man who lived his entire life by the clock. He wore a meticulously tailored charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place in the grease-stained establishment. His silver hair was damp from the rain, and his shoulders were hunched under the invisible weight of the impending legal disaster he believed we were walking into. He clutched his expensive leather briefcase to his chest like a shield. He scanned the room, his eyes filled with a frantic, nervous energy, until he finally spotted me sitting in the dim corner booth. He rushed over and slid into the vinyl seat across from me. He did not bother to take off his wet coat. He just stared at my faded jacket and the dark circles beneath my eyes. A look of profound pity washed over his face. It was the absolute last thing I wanted to see from my legal counsel, but I understood his completely misguided compassion. He ordered a black coffee from the passing waitress and waited until she was out of earshot before leaning across the sticky laminate table. His voice was a harsh, desperate whisper. He told me we did not have to go through with this mediation. He begged me to listen to reason. He explained that he had spent the entire night reviewing the aggressive terms Justin and his predatory lawyers had forwarded to our office. They were not just asking for my operational control of the freight company. They were demanding an absolute ironclad waiver of every single spousal survivorship right I possessed regarding Evelyn's entire personal estate. Wallace looked at my worn clothes and told me that if I signed that specific document, I would be voluntarily walking away from millions of dollars. He warned me that Justin was actively trying to leave me utterly destitute on the streets. He pleaded with me to let him file an emergency injunction to halt the mediation process. He promised he could drag Justin through the appellate courts for years and force a massive financial settlement. He begged me not to surrender my entire life's work to a spoiled, arrogant child just because I was tired of fighting. I listened to my oldest confidant in complete, absolute silence. I let him empty his lungs and vent his professional terrors. Wallace had stood by my side during the most difficult negotiations of my career. He had helped me navigate the ruthless logistics industry with unparalleled legal brilliance. But he was a man who operated strictly in the realm of conventional corporate warfare. He analyzed contracts and fought over percentages. He simply could not fathom the psychological depth of the trap I had spent the last several weeks constructing from the shadows of a cheap motel room. He looked at my faded canvas jacket and saw a broken, defeated old man waving a white flag of surrender. He did not understand that my worn appearance was simply the perfect camouflage. I was not a victim walking blindly to the slaughter. I was the architect of the slaughter itself. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The bitter liquid burned the back of my throat, grounding me in the reality of the moment. I looked deeply into Wallace's frantic eyes and told him I appreciated his loyalty more than he would ever know. I told him I understood exactly what Justin was attempting to do today. Justin wanted to publicly humiliate me in that mediation room. Justin wanted to sit across a polished mahogany table surrounded by his expensive corporate sharks and force me to physically sign away my dignity. He wanted the absolute legal certainty that I could never touch a single dime of his mother's wealth or interfere with his desperate plan to liquidate the freight brand. I acknowledged every single one of Wallace's terrifying warnings. I agreed that signing that waiver would officially and permanently sever my legal ties to Pierce Midwest Freight and Evelyn's estate. I told Wallace that was exactly what I was going to do. Wallace's face dropped in sheer disbelief. He ran a shaking hand through his damp silver hair and let out a long, heavy sigh of absolute defeat. He told me I was making the greatest mistake of my life. He warned me that Justin had already secured a massive fraudulent bridge loan against the family estate. Wallace explained that Justin was bringing $5 million in liquid capital to the mediation table today, specifically to crush any legal resistance we might offer. Justin was fully armed and ready for a brutal war of attrition. Wallace looked at me with genuine sorrow and asked me what I was going to do when the dust settled and I was left with absolutely nothing. He asked me how I planned to survive when Justin officially took complete ownership of the legacy I had bled for 40 years to build. He told me I would be living in that cheap motel for the rest of my days, while my stepson paraded around the city spending the money I had earned. I set my ceramic coffee mug down on the table. The dull thud sounded louder than I intended. I reached deep into the inside pocket of my faded canvas jacket. My fingers brushed against the thick, folded paper I had printed just an hour before. I slowly withdrew the document and placed it flat on the table between us. It was a single sheet of heavy legal paper. The top and bottom margins were heavily redacted with thick black marker to protect the absolute highest levels of confidentiality. I slid the paper smoothly across the sticky laminate surface until it rested directly in front of Wallace's expensive leather briefcase. I told him quietly to read the central paragraph before he said another word. Wallace looked down at the document with immense confusion. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his reading glasses, slipping them carefully onto the bridge of his nose. He picked up the single sheet of paper and began to read the dense legal text. I watched his eyes track back and forth across the page. At first, his brow was deeply furrowed in typical lawyerly concentration. He was trying to decipher the complex corporate ownership structure detailed in the central unredacted paragraph. He read the legal registry name, Ironclad Holdings. He read the exclusive operational rights. He read the absolute ownership of the 70 acres of prime industrial land, the massive shipping warehouse, the maintenance bays, and the entire commercial truck fleet leased to Pierce Midwest Freight. He read the clauses detailing the massive financial penalties that were automatically triggered the exact moment a lease payment was intentionally withheld. He saw the staggering $500,000 penalty fee Justin had unwittingly activated when he blocked the monthly rent wire just a few days prior. Then his eyes hit the final line of the paragraph, the line that clearly and undeniably identified the sole executive director, the absolute primary shareholder, and the singular legal owner of the entire anonymous holding trust. It was my name printed in stark, bold letters right at the bottom of the page. The physical transformation of Mr. Wallace was instantaneous and absolutely breathtaking to witness. The healthy pink color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like polished porcelain. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. His hands began to tremble so violently the heavy paper shook in his grip, causing a sharp rattling noise in the quiet diner booth. He read the central paragraph a second time, and then a third time, as if his brilliant legal mind was refusing to process the sheer catastrophic magnitude of the information. He slowly lowered the paper back to the table and took off his reading glasses with a shaky hand. He looked up at me. He looked at my faded canvas jacket. He looked at my calm, unblinking eyes. He finally saw the absolute truth. He realized that Justin was not marching into that mediation room to conquer a multi-million-dollar logistics empire. Justin was marching into that room to officially and legally demand total ownership of an empty, worthless shell. I was not signing away my legacy today. I was tricking Justin into legally assuming all the massive debt and toxic liabilities of the operational company, while I quietly retained absolute ownership of every single valuable physical asset through my private, hidden trust. By signing that waiver, I was officially handing Justin the steering wheel to a car that had no engine, no tires, and no brakes, as it plummeted straight toward a concrete wall. Wallace realized that the massive $5 million fraudulent loan Justin had just taken out against the family estate was completely useless to him. Justin thought he was using that borrowed cash to fight a phantom landlord in civil court. He had absolutely no idea the phantom landlord was sitting directly across from him, ready to seize every single dollar of that fraudulent loan the moment the lease penalty clauses were officially legally enforced. Justin had borrowed predatory money simply to hand it directly to me to cover the financial penalties he had stupidly triggered. I was going to legally drain his stolen cash and then simply repossess the entire company anyway. The profound pity that had clouded Wallace's face just moments ago completely vanished. It was instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated awe and a deep, terrifying realization of exactly what kind of man I truly was. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking in the silence of the diner booth. He carefully folded the piece of paper and slid it respectfully back across the table to me. He picked up his coffee mug with steady hands and took a long drink. A slow, dark smile crept across his face, transforming him from a worried friend into a ruthless legal shark who had just smelled blood in the water. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his eyes burning with absolute predatory anticipation. He looked at me and asked quietly, "When do we drop the guillotine?" The rain finally cleared, leaving a cold, damp chill in the heavy air around the cheap motel. I sat at the small, wobbly desk and opened my laptop one more time. Mr. Wallace had left the diner with a clear directive and a renewed sense of ruthless purpose. It was time for me to execute the next phase of the silent war. I logged into a highly secure private network, bypassing the standard domestic financial gateways completely. I accessed a series of offshore holding accounts I had quietly maintained for over 30 years. Evelyn and I had built our wealth slowly and deliberately, far away from the greedy eyes of her entitled children. I had millions of dollars in liquid capital resting safely in anonymous trusts scattered across highly secure international jurisdictions. Justin and Valerie thought I was a helpless old man sleeping on a sagging mattress in a dangerous part of town. They had absolutely no idea I possessed the massive financial firepower to buy and sell their entire pathetic lives a dozen times over. I carefully reviewed the digital details of the predatory loan they had secured against my family home. The shadow lenders they used were notorious across the city for issuing high-risk bridge capital at extortionate interest rates. These shadow firms did not care about the specific borrowers, they only cared about the underlying physical collateral and the lucrative secondary debt market. I initiated a direct encrypted communication with my primary offshore financial broker. I instructed him to approach the shadow lending firm and make an aggressive blind offer to purchase the entire $5 million debt note. The firm was incredibly eager to offload the high-risk paper for an immediate guaranteed cash premium. I authorized the massive wire transfer without a single moment of hesitation. The digital funds moved silently across the globe in a matter of minutes. By late afternoon, the complex transaction was officially complete and legally recorded on the private registry. The shadow lenders transferred the entire debt portfolio, including the fraudulent collateral lien, directly into my private holding trust. I was no longer just the phantom landlord of the logistics company. I was now the absolute owner of the predatory loan Justin and Valerie had used to finance their desperate survival. Owning their specific debt gave me absolute total control over their immediate financial reality. I opened the digital loan agreement and read the strict covenant clauses they had eagerly signed just hours before. The terms drafted by the predatory lenders were draconian and completely unforgiving. Any material breach of contract or discovery of application fraud allowed the primary debt holder to initiate an immediate and total asset freeze. Justin and Valerie had committed blatant bank fraud by leveraging a family estate they did not legally own. Furthermore, the operational freight company was already in a state of catastrophic default regarding the warehouse lease payments. I did not need to wait for a judge to review the dense paperwork or for a long corporate investigation to formally conclude. I acted directly as the primary creditor and unilaterally invoked the maximum penalty clauses. I triggered a massive synchronized financial lockdown across their entire network. I sent the automated legal directives directly to their primary banking institutions. The response was immediate and utterly devastating. Every single account tied to Justin and Valerie was instantly frozen solid. Their joint checking accounts, their corporate tech startup funds, their personal savings, and their emergency credit lines were completely locked down by the banking servers. The digital vaults snapped shut, trapping them entirely. They could not withdraw a single dollar. They could not transfer funds to their lawyers, and they could not access the remaining balance of the fraudulent loan they had risked their absolute freedom to obtain. The financial lifeblood they desperately needed to maintain their arrogant illusions was severed with a single calculated keystroke. I sat back in the creaking motel chair and watched the official confirmation alerts flood my secure inbox. The invisible trap was pulling incredibly tight around their throats, cutting off their oxygen completely. The crushing reality of the sudden asset freeze hit Valerie first. She was entirely oblivious to the catastrophic collapse of the freight yard and the impending legal doom closing in on her brother. She was spending her quiet afternoon in the most exclusive high-end shopping district in the city center. She walked into a bright, pristine designer boutique, carrying herself with the arrogant entitlement of a woman who believed she was completely untouchable. She spent 2 full hours trying on expensive imported silk dresses and demanding absolute subservience from the exhausted retail staff. She ultimately selected a breathtaking custom gown intended for the upcoming victory celebration she falsely believed she would soon attend. She approached the polished glass counter and carelessly tossed her premium black credit card onto the surface. She expected the cashier to run the card package the expensive dress and offer a polite, deferential bow. Instead, the digital payment terminal flashed a harsh red warning. The cashier discreetly and politely informed Valerie that the transaction had been declined by the host bank. Valerie scoffed loudly and insulted the cashier's intelligence, blaming the luxury boutique for having a faulty machine. She aggressively dug into her designer leather purse and pulled out a secondary platinum card. The cashier swiped it again with trembling hands. The machine beeped a second loud, definitive denial. The polite, professional smile instantly vanished from the cashier's face. The other wealthy patrons in the quiet boutique stopped browsing the racks and turned to watch the unfolding spectacle with intense curiosity. Valerie felt a sudden hot wave of panic rise in her chest as she presented a third card tied directly to the newly acquired predatory loan funds. The terminal rejected it instantly and displayed a stark code indicating a total mandatory account freeze. The public humiliation was absolute and physically suffocating. Valerie snatched her useless plastic cards from the glass counter, her face burning a bright, furious red. She was forced to abandon the designer dress and march out of the boutique, trying desperately to maintain a shred of false dignity while the retail staff stared after her in cold, silent judgment. She sat inside her luxury vehicle in the rain-slicked parking lot and screamed hysterically, hitting the leather steering wheel with her clenched fists. She dialed Justin's number, demanding an immediate explanation for her profound public embarrassment. She drove recklessly across town and burst through the heavy glass doors of Pierce Midwest Freight. The administrative offices were completely dark and deserted. The massive shipping yard outside was entirely empty, except for the jagged, silent rows of abandoned 18-wheelers. The mechanics had walked out, the drivers had vanished, and the clerical staff had fled the sinking ship before the afternoon was even over. The silence echoing through the corporate headquarters was heavy and deeply terrifying. Valerie found Justin pacing frantically in my former corner office. His expensive tailored suit jacket was discarded carelessly on the floor, and his silk tie was pulled loose. He looked exactly like a trapped wild animal pacing the length of his shrinking cage. Valerie screamed at him, demanding to know why her cards were blocked and why the massive building was completely empty. Justin turned on her with a vicious, explosive rage. He blamed her entirely for their current terrifying nightmare. He yelled that her reckless, endless spending and her constant demands for luxury had completely drained his tech startup and forced him into this impossible corner. Valerie screamed back, calling him an incompetent, pathetic failure. She viciously reminded him that it was his brilliant idea to commit federal bank fraud and illegally leverage their mother's estate. The ugly, brutal truth of their profound arrogance finally shattered the thin, lingering illusion of their sibling loyalty. They stood in the center of the dark, expensive office, hurling vicious, deeply personal insults and tearing each other apart. They realized with absolute horrifying clarity that the $5 million they had risked federal prison to obtain was completely inaccessible. The phantom landlord was closing in. The lucrative freight contracts were gone, and their personal creditors were actively preparing to devour them whole. They were completely and utterly alone in a massive empty building they had stolen but could not control. The frantic screaming slowly subsided into a cold, heavy desperation. They stopped yelling and stared blankly at the dark walls of the ruined executive office. They had only one single fragile thread of hope left to cling to in the darkness. Tomorrow afternoon, they were scheduled to meet me in the formal mediation room at the county courthouse. Justin desperately convinced himself and his terrified sister that I was just a tired, broken old man hiding in a cheap motel. He assured Valerie that I was completely terrified by his ruthless threats regarding their mother's medical legacy. They built a massive, comforting delusion to soothe their frantic, panic-stricken minds. They firmly believed that once I signed away my final spousal survivorship rights, they could instantly unfreeze the corporate assets, sell the Pierce Midwest brand to a corporate liquidator, and escape the collapsing empire with millions of dollars in clean, untraceable cash. They needed my signature on that document more than they needed oxygen to breathe. They convinced themselves absolutely that tomorrow would be their ultimate victory and their grand, permanent escape. They desperately planned to walk into that mediation room and force my total, humiliating surrender. They had absolutely no idea that I was simply waiting patiently for them to walk through those heavy wooden doors and lock themselves permanently inside the inescapable prison I had built. The heavy glass door of the diner swung shut behind me, cutting off the warm smell of burnt coffee and fried bacon. The evening air was bitterly cold. The heavy rain from the afternoon had finally faded into a dense, freezing mist that hung low over the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. The buzzing neon sign above the diner cast a pale, flickering light across the wet pavement, illuminating the deep puddles and the scattered patches of dirty gravel. I pulled the collar of my faded canvas jacket up against the chill and walked slowly toward the dark corner of the lot where my rusted truck was parked. I felt a profound, steady calm settling deep into my bones. Mr. Wallace had left the diner an hour ago, armed with the absolute truth and a ruthless new legal strategy. The pieces were perfectly aligned on the board. Before I could reach the driver's side door, a pair of blinding white headlights swept aggressively across the dark parking lot. A pristine black luxury utility vehicle accelerated through the entrance and swerved sharply, cutting directly across the painted lines to block my truck into its parking space. The heavy engine idled with a low, menacing hum. I stopped walking and stood perfectly still in the freezing mist. I watched the doors of the immaculate vehicle swing open. I fully expected to see the same tactical security guards Justin had sent to my motel room the previous night. I expected another desperate attempt at cheap physical intimidation, but the heavy boots of hired muscle did not step out onto the wet asphalt. Instead, two pairs of expensive designer heels splashed directly into the shallow, dirty puddles. Valerie and Monica stepped out of the warm luxury vehicle and into the cold, damp night. They looked entirely out of place standing under the flickering neon lights of a roadside diner. Valerie was wrapped in a tailored cashmere coat, her perfect hair already beginning to fall flat in the heavy mist. Monica stood beside her, clutching a designer leather purse tightly to her chest, shivering slightly in the freezing air. They had clearly spent the entire afternoon reeling from the absolute catastrophic lockdown of their financial accounts. They had felt the terrifying invisible walls of my trap closing in around them, and they had panicked. They knew the security guards had completely failed to force my signature. They knew Justin was drowning in a sea of massive unpayable debts and a completely paralyzed logistics company. They were absolutely desperate for the mediation hearing tomorrow afternoon. They needed my signature on that legal waiver to unfreeze their stolen empire and escape the crushing consequences of their own federal bank fraud. Since raw intimidation had failed, the two women had clearly decided to pivot their strategy. They had tracked me down to play the roles of the compassionate peacemakers. They were here to execute the classic good cop routine, hoping to manipulate my pride and my supposed exhaustion. Valerie took the lead, walking slowly toward me with a perfectly rehearsed expression of deep familial concern plastered across her face. She stopped a few feet away, keeping a safe distance from my rusted truck. She looked at my faded clothes and the worn boots on my feet. She let out a soft, dramatic sigh, shaking her head, as if the sight of me was simply too painful to bear. She spoke my name with a sickly sweet tone that made my stomach turn. She told me how incredibly sad it was to see me living like this. She gestured vaguely toward the cheap diner and mentioned the dirty motel I was sleeping in. She painted a pathetic picture of a broken old man who had completely lost his way after the tragic death of his wife. I did not say a single word. I simply stood in the cold mist and let her talk. Silence is a mirror, and arrogant people absolutely hate looking into it. Valerie continued her desperate monologue. She told me that Justin had been entirely too harsh the previous morning. She claimed her brother was just under a massive amount of corporate stress, trying to manage the massive freight empire his mother had left behind. She expertly framed his ruthless, hostile takeover and his illegal lockouts as a simple, tragic misunderstanding between two grieving men. She told me that she and Monica had come here tonight because they genuinely cared about my well-being. They wanted to fix this ugly family dispute before we walked into a cold, unforgiving courtroom tomorrow. Monica chimed in from the shadows, nodding her head in vigorous agreement. She put on the mask of the sweet, devoted daughter-in-law, a role she had completely abandoned years ago. She told me that nobody wanted to see me suffer. She said they just wanted everyone to walk away from this terrible situation with peace of mind. They were weaving a massive, comforting illusion. They were trying to convince me that I was a helpless victim who desperately needed their benevolent rescue. They wanted me to believe that signing away my entire life's work was actually a profound act of healing and closure. Valerie took a slow, deliberate step toward the hood of my rusted truck. She reached a manicured hand into the deep pocket of her cashmere coat and pulled out a thick, crisp white envelope. She placed it gently on the cold, wet metal of the hood, right in front of me. She patted the paper with her fingers, treating it like a precious gift. She lowered her voice, adopting a tone of extreme generous charity. She explained the terms of her pathetic bribe. She told me the envelope contained $1,000 in untraceable cash. She said it was a gesture of total good faith from her and Justin. She promised that if I simply showed up at the courthouse tomorrow afternoon and smoothly signed the absolute waiver relinquishing all my spousal rights, they would put me on a permanent monthly allowance. They would send me $1,000 every single month for the rest of my natural life. She painted a beautiful picture of my future. She told me I could use the money to move out of the freezing Midwest. I could drive down to Florida or Arizona. I could find a quiet little apartment in the sun and live out my final years in absolute comfort, completely free from the massive, stressful burdens of the shipping industry and the family estate. All I had to do was take the envelope, get in my truck, and sign my own permanent erasure into the public record tomorrow. I stared down at the crisp white paper resting on the wet, rusted metal. I looked at the physical cash bulging slightly from the unsealed flap. The sheer absolute irony of the moment was almost too profound to process. I knew exactly why they had brought physical paper bills instead of offering to write me a corporate check or initiate a bank transfer. I had personally locked down every single digital financial artery they possessed just hours before. I owned the massive predatory loan they had fraudulently secured against my home. I had triggered the absolute asset freezes across their entire banking network. Valerie's platinum cards were completely useless plastic. Justin's corporate accounts were frozen solid by the underwriters. That single envelopes of cash sitting on the hood of my truck was likely the absolute last bit of liquid capital they had managed to scrape together. They had probably emptied their personal home safes and scoured the bottoms of their designer purses just to gather those specific bills. They were entirely bankrupt. They were suffocating under the weight of massive federal fraud and commercial default. Yet they were standing in a freezing parking lot, pretending they were wealthy, benevolent monarchs, tossing loose breadcrumbs to a starving peasant. They were desperately trying to purchase a $50 million logistics empire using the literal last pennies to their names. I did not reach for the envelope. I did not move my hands from my sides. The freezing mist slowly gathered on the white paper, dampening the edges. The silence stretched between us, growing heavier and more terrifying by the second. Valerie and Monica stared at me, waiting for the grateful tears and the eager acceptance they felt they so richly deserved. But as the seconds ticked past, their confident smiles began to falter. The deep, suffocating panic they had tried so hard to bury beneath their designer coats began to bleed through their eyes. They realized I was not looking at the money. I was looking directly through them. I was observing their trembling hands and their rapid, shallow breathing. I finally broke the long, crushing silence. My voice was incredibly calm, carrying the deep, resonant weight of absolute certainty. I looked Valerie dead in her terrified eyes. I told her she could not buy a man with the change from his own pocket. I did not raise my voice. I did not insult her or threaten her. I simply delivered the cold, unvarnished truth of their existence. The color completely washed out of Valerie's face, leaving her looking like a pale ghost standing in the glow of the neon sign. Monica gasped softly, taking a terrified step backward, bumping into the side of their idling luxury vehicle. They did not understand the profound, literal truth of my statement, but they felt the terrifying absolute power behind it. They realized in that freezing moment that the good cop routine had failed just as miserably as the security guards. They realized they possessed absolutely no leverage, no power, and no control over the man standing in front of them. I did not wait for them to formulate a response. I calmly reached past the damp white envelope, unlocked the heavy door of my rusted truck, and climbed inside. I shut the door with a loud, solid metallic thud, completely severing their desperate presence from my world. I turned the ignition key, and the old engine roared to life, sending a thick cloud of exhaust into the cold, damp air. I switched on the headlights, blinding them temporarily. I did not look back at them as I shifted the truck into gear and pulled slowly out of the parking space. I drove straight toward the highway, leaving Valerie and Monica standing entirely alone in the freezing mist. I left them staring at a wet, useless envelope of cash on the empty pavement, deeply confused, utterly terrified, and totally unprepared for the absolute slaughter that awaited them in the mediation room tomorrow. The heavy rain from the previous night had finally stopped, leaving the city streets slick and shining under the overcast gray sky. I drove my rusted truck through the busy downtown traffic, keeping my hands steady on the worn steering wheel. Mr. Wallace sat in the passenger seat, clutching his expensive leather briefcase with a fierce, protective grip. We did not speak during the drive. There was nothing left to discuss or debate. The trap I had meticulously built over the last several weeks was fully armed and waiting to be triggered. Wallace knew the sheer devastating magnitude of the secret hidden inside his briefcase. He knew we were driving toward a legal slaughter of unprecedented proportions. I parked the truck in the damp concrete garage, and we walked together toward the towering marble columns of the county courthouse. The massive building loomed above us, projecting an aura of cold, unyielding authority. We passed through the heavy security checkpoints and navigated the crowded, chaotic public lobby. We stepped into the quiet executive elevator and rode it up to the private mediation suites on the top floor. The atmosphere up there was entirely different from the noisy courts below. The air was sterile and heavily filtered, smelling faintly of expensive lemon polish and stale, nervous sweat. We walked down the long, carpeted corridor, listening to the muffled sounds of our own footsteps. We approached the frosted glass door of Mediation Room 4. I took a slow, deep breath, pulling the cold, filtered air into my lungs. I centered my mind and embraced the quiet, freezing calm that had sustained me through 40 years of ruthless corporate warfare. I reached out and pushed the heavy mahogany door open. The mediation room was expansive and deliberately intimidating. A massive, polished wooden table dominated the center of the space, reflecting the harsh white glare of the overhead lights. Justin, Valerie, and Monica were already seated on the far side of the massive table. They had intentionally arrived early to claim the physical high ground and project an aura of absolute invincible dominance. They were flanked by their highly aggressive corporate attorney, Mr. Blackwood. The four of them formed a unified wall of pure, unadulterated arrogance. But I had spent decades reading the subtle body language of desperate men. I looked past their expensive clothes and their rehearsed postures. I saw the absolute terror hiding just beneath the surface of their skin. Justin wore a tailored navy blue suit that was perfectly pressed and fitted. He leaned far back in his plush leather executive chair, trying to look like a bored, victorious king. But his right leg bounced with a frantic, uncontrollable, nervous energy under the table. Dark, heavy circles were carved deeply beneath his bloodshot eyes. He had spent the entire night suffocating under the crushing reality of his frozen bank accounts and his paralyzed freight company. He was completely bankrupt and actively hiding massive federal bank fraud from the authorities. He desperately needed this meeting to save his own life. Valerie sat rigidly beside him, wearing a severe black designer dress. Her face was locked in a tight mask of cold superiority, but her hands trembled slightly as she gripped a gold pen. She was still reeling from the profound public humiliation she had suffered at the luxury boutique yesterday afternoon. Monica sat quietly at the very end of the table, staring intently at the polished wood. She was desperately playing the role of the innocent bystander, hoping her luxury credit lines would miraculously be unfrozen by tomorrow morning. They were all drowning men, pretending they knew how to swim. Mr. Blackwood stood up abruptly as Wallace and I took our seats on the opposite side of the broad table. Blackwood was a classic corporate predator. He wore a flashy silver watch and a slick, patronizing smile designed to make opposing parties feel small and insignificant. He did not offer a polite greeting or extend his hand across the table. He immediately opened his thick leather folio and began extracting a massive stack of dense legal documents. He spread the heavy white papers across the mahogany surface with a practiced theatrical flair. He wanted to ensure I felt the immense crushing weight of the legal machinery he was bringing down upon my head. Blackwood launched directly into his aggressive opening monologue. His voice was loud and commanding, bouncing harshly off the sterile walls of the small room. He announced that we were here today to formally and permanently conclude the unfortunate family dispute regarding the estate of the late Evelyn. He used my dead wife's name, casually treating her pristine legacy like a simple, annoying line item on a corporate spreadsheet. He haughtily explained that his clients were acting with extreme, unprecedented generosity by allowing me to sign away my rights quietly behind closed doors. He explicitly stated they were doing me a massive favor by not dragging me through a humiliating public trial. He was directly referencing the disgusting, vile threat Justin had made over the phone the previous night. They truly believed I was sitting there in my faded canvas jacket, trembling in absolute fear that they would destroy Evelyn's memory with fake medical reports. Blackwood slid the final heavy stack of surrender documents directly across the smooth, polished wood until it rested right in front of my hands. He tapped the thick cover page with his expensive gold pen. He began to detail exactly what the document would legally accomplish the exact moment my signature touched the paper. He explained that this binding absolute agreement was an irrevocable total waiver of all my statutory spousal survivorship rights. It completely and permanently severed any and all legal ties I possessed to Evelyn's personal estate, including the family home and the surrounding 70 acres of property. But the arrogant lawyer did not stop there. He wanted to make absolutely sure that I could never touch the lucrative logistics company again. Blackwood puffed out his chest and proudly read aloud the specific corporate clauses Justin had desperately demanded he include in the settlement. Blackwood stated that this document formally, legally, and unconditionally recognized Justin and Valerie as the sole absolute owners of Pierce Midwest Freight. He emphasized heavily that by signing the paper, I was legally abandoning any future claim to the corporate brand, the operational framework, and every single one of its associated liabilities. That specific word hung suspended in the cold, sterile air of the mediation room. Liabilities. Blackwood and Justin thought they were being incredibly clever and utterly ruthless. They knew the operational freight company was currently bleeding cash and facing massive vendor defaults because of the mechanic strike and the driver walkout. They wanted to make absolutely certain that I could never return to claim the company was grossly mismanaged or sue them for the corporate debts they were rapidly accumulating. They wanted me permanently locked out of the financial fallout so they could execute a clean fire sale of the corporate brand. They thought they were building a massive, impenetrable legal wall to protect themselves from my future interference. They had absolutely no idea they were simply tying a massive iron anchor directly to their own throats. By legally claiming total, absolute ownership of Pierce Midwest Freight and all of its extensive liabilities, they were formally accepting total binding responsibility for the massive $500,000 lease penalty they owed to Ironclad Holdings. They were legally binding their own personal futures to the highly toxic debt of a company that owned absolutely zero physical assets. They thought they were stealing a $50 million logistics empire from a tired old man. They were actually signing a legally binding confession that they were solely financially responsible for the catastrophic ruin of an empty corporate shell. I looked down at the thick stack of white papers resting silently in front of me. The legal text was dense and filled with aggressive, punitive corporate jargon. It was deliberately designed to look and feel like a total, humiliating, absolute surrender. I kept my face entirely blank, masking the profound, deep satisfaction building steadily in my chest. I glanced sideways at Mr. Wallace. My lawyer sat perfectly still, his hands resting quietly on top of his locked leather briefcase. Inside that specific briefcase was the single redacted document proving my absolute ownership of Ironclad Holdings. Wallace knew exactly what was happening right in front of us. He knew we were sitting in a room full of arrogant, blind fools who were eagerly begging me to hand them the rope they would use to hang themselves. Wallace did not say a single word. He simply gave me a slow, barely perceptible nod of absolute readiness. The silence in the mediation room stretched out, becoming incredibly thick and heavy with unspoken anticipation. Justin simply could not handle the quiet tension. His arrogant, impatient nature would not allow him to sit back and let his expensive lawyer finish the mundane transaction. He desperately needed to gloat. He needed to feel like the conquering, victorious king looking down at the defeated, broken peasant. Justin leaned far forward across the wide mahogany table, invading my physical space. He rested his elbows aggressively on the polished wood and flashed a cruel, predatory grin. His eyes burned with a manic, terrifying, desperate energy. He truly and completely believed he had beaten me into absolute submission. He believed his brutal intimidation tactics, his late-night security thugs, and his disgusting threats against his own mother's legacy had completely shattered my spirit. He looked at my worn, faded clothes and my silent, calm demeanor and saw only total, pathetic defeat. He thought the $5 million fraudulent loan he had illegally secured against my home was safely hidden away from my knowledge. He thought he was just one single signature away from liquidating the corporate brand, paying off his massive tech debts, and walking away as a wealthy, victorious corporate genius. Justin looked me dead in the eyes and sneered with total, unfiltered contempt. He told me to stop stalling and face reality. He said the game was finally over, and I had lost absolutely everything. He told me to pick up the pen, sign the damn paper, and get the hell out of his life forever. He spat the cruel words across the table, radiating a venomous, toxic hatred. Valerie smirked from her leather chair, crossing her arms tightly over her chest, in a silent, arrogant display of absolute victory. Monica let out a soft, quiet sigh of profound relief, thinking her luxury designer credit cards would finally be unfrozen by tomorrow morning. They were all completely and utterly blind to the horrific reality of the room. I did not react to Justin's petty, desperate insults. I did not raise my voice or attempt to defend my wounded pride. A man who holds all the absolute power never needs to shout to be heard. I looked directly into Justin's manic, exhausted eyes and saw the massive, terrifying financial abyss waiting for him just on the other side of this single transaction. I slowly reached out my right hand. My weathered fingers brushed against the cold, heavy metal of the expensive brass pen resting right beside the surrender documents. I picked up the pen, feeling its solid weight in my steady grip. I pulled the thick stack of legal papers a few inches closer to the edge of the table. I prepared to sign away the complete illusion of my empire and lock the heavy steel doors of their absolute permanent destruction. The heavy brass pen felt cold and solid in my weathered hand. I looked down at the thick stack of legal documents resting on the polished mahogany table. Blackwood had marked every single signature line with a bright yellow sticky note. I moved the pen to the first line and pressed the metal tip against the crisp white paper. The scratching sound of the ink flowing onto the page echoed loudly in the dead silence of the mediation room. I signed my full legal name with slow, deliberate strokes. I did not rush the process. I wanted every single person on the opposite side of the table to feel the weight of the moment. I flipped to the next page and signed again. I repeated this methodical process exactly 14 times until every single yellow note was fulfilled. I placed the brass pen gently back onto the wooden table. The dull metallic click sounded like a heavy prison door locking permanently into place. Justin let out a massive, explosive breath of air that he had been holding in his lungs for days. He slumped back into his plush leather executive chair, completely deflated by his sudden, overwhelming relief. A wide, arrogant grin spread across his pale, exhausted face. Valerie uncrossed her arms and visibly relaxed her rigid posture. She smoothed the fabric of her severe black designer dress and looked at me with an expression of pure, absolute contempt. She truly believed she had just witnessed the total, pathetic destruction of my entire life. Monica let out a soft, quiet laugh from the end of the table. She was already mentally calculating exactly how fast she could run to the luxury boutiques once the asset freezes were magically lifted. Mr. Blackwood reached across the wide table with eager, greedy hands. He gathered the signed documents into a neat stack and tapped them against the wood to align the edges. His slick, patronizing smile returned in full force. Justin leaned forward again, resting his elbows on the table. He looked at me and told me it was finally over. He told me to pack up my pathetic bags and leave his family alone forever. He boasted that he was now the sole, absolute owner of Pierce Midwest Freight and every single asset tied to the corporate name. He claimed he had beaten me at my own game and secured his mother's legacy for himself. He spoke with the reckless, blind confidence of a man who genuinely believed he had just executed a flawless victory. He told me I was a foolish old man who never truly belonged in their wealthy elite world. He advised me to use my remaining pennies to buy a bus ticket out of the state before he decided to press further legal charges just for his own personal amusement. I did not break eye contact with my arrogant stepson. I sat perfectly still in my faded canvas jacket, letting his cruel insults wash over me like a warm summer breeze. I waited until the absolute peak of his gloating monologue. I waited until his massive, fragile ego was completely exposed. I looked at Justin and told him quietly that I completely agreed with his assessment. I told him he was indeed the sole absolute owner of the operational logistics company. I reminded him that his aggressive lawyer had made it very clear in the binding legal text. Justin and Valerie now officially possessed total ownership of the Pierce Midwest Freight brand and every single one of its mounting financial liabilities. I told them they were now 100% legally responsible for the catastrophic debts, the ruined contracts, and the massive commercial penalties the company had accumulated over the past week. Mr. Wallace moved with a slow, quiet precision beside me. He reached down and clicked the brass latches of his expensive leather briefcase. He opened the lid and extracted a single sheet of heavy, pristine legal paper. It was the exact same document he had read in the dingy diner the previous morning. There were no heavy black redactions on this copy. The entire complex corporate ownership structure was printed in clear, undeniable black ink. Wallace placed the document gently on the table right in front of me. I placed my fingertips lightly on the edge of the thick paper. I pushed it slowly across the smooth, polished mahogany surface. The paper glided silently, stopping exactly in front of Mr. Blackwood's neat stack of surrender documents. I did not look at Justin or Valerie. I kept my eyes completely locked on their aggressive corporate attorney. I told Blackwood to read the central paragraph before he filed his final victory papers with the county clerk. Blackwood looked down at the single sheet of paper with a look of extreme annoyance. He clearly believed this was just a pathetic, desperate attempt by a defeated man to cause a minor bureaucratic delay. He picked up the document with his manicured fingers and scanned the top lines with total disinterest. But as his eyes moved down the page, his slick, patronizing smile began to falter. He read the legal registry name of the anonymous holding trust. He read the ironclad clauses granting the trust absolute exclusive ownership of the 70 acres of prime industrial land and the massive commercial truck fleet. His eyes darted back and forth across the dense legal text, reading the punishing penalty clauses Justin had blindly triggered when he intentionally withheld the monthly lease payments. Then Blackwood reached the final bold line at the very bottom of the page. He saw my name listed as the sole executive director and the absolute primary shareholder of Ironclad Holdings. The physical reaction was immediate and absolutely devastating. Every single drop of blood vanished from Blackwood's face, leaving his skin the color of dirty chalk. His mouth fell open in a silent gasp of pure, unadulterated professional terror. The heavy legal paper began to rattle violently as his hands shook out of control. He dropped the document onto the mahogany table as if the paper itself had suddenly caught fire. He took a sharp, ragged breath, his chest heaving under his tailored suit. He had walked into this room believing he was negotiating a simple, hostile takeover against a weak opponent. He suddenly realized he had just legally advised his clients to sign a binding financial suicide pact. He realized that the $5 million fraudulent loan his clients had illegally obtained was now entirely forfeit to the very man sitting calmly across the table. He understood the profound, sheer magnitude of the trap I had built. The triumphant atmosphere in the mediation room evaporated instantly. The thick, heavy silence returned, but it was no longer filled with arrogant anticipation. It was filled with a cold, suffocating dread. Justin noticed the sudden catastrophic change in his lawyer's demeanor. The arrogant grin melted off Justin's face, replaced by a look of deep, profound confusion. He looked at the trembling lawyer and then looked down at the single sheet of paper resting on the table. Valerie sat up perfectly straight, her dark eyes darting frantically between Blackwood and her brother. She demanded to know what the document was and why their lawyer looked like he had just seen a ghost. Monica stopped her quiet laughing and shrank back into her leather chair, feeling the invisible walls of the room closing in on them. They were entirely clueless, but the primal animal terror radiating from Blackwood infected them completely. Blackwood did not answer Valerie's frantic demands. He did not look at the signed surrender documents he had eagerly collected just moments before. Those papers were now nothing more than a formal, legally binding confession of total, absolute financial ruin. Blackwood slowly turned his head to look at Justin. The aggressive corporate shark looked completely broken and thoroughly defeated. His voice trembled violently when he finally spoke, breaking the heavy, terrifying silence of the room. He did not yell or shout. He looked at Justin in absolute horror and asked him a single devastating question. He asked Justin who his landlord was. Justin stared blindly at the shaking lawyer, unable to process the words. He asked Blackwood what he meant by that ridiculous question. Justin insisted that his mother owned the land and the trucks. He claimed it was all part of the family estate that he had just officially secured. Blackwood shook his head slowly, his eyes wide with a manic terror. He pointed a trembling finger at the single sheet of paper on the table. He told Justin that Evelyn had never owned the physical assets of the logistics company. He explained that a private anonymous trust called Ironclad Holdings owned every single inch of the concrete, every single steel beam of the warehouse, and every single diesel engine in the fleet. He told Justin that the operational company he had just proudly claimed sole ownership of was nothing more than a glorified tenant with a massive, toxic, catastrophic debt. Blackwood looked back at me and then back at Justin. He told his arrogant client that the man sitting across the table in the faded canvas jacket was the absolute sole owner of Ironclad Holdings. I watched the devastating truth slowly filter into Justin's exhausted, panicked mind. I watched him mentally connect the horrifying dots. He realized that the massive monthly lease payments he had deliberately blocked were owed directly to me. He realized that the staggering $500,000 penalty fee he had blindly activated was owed directly to me. He realized that by signing the formal documents claiming absolute ownership of Pierce Midwest Freight, he had legally and permanently accepted total personal responsibility for those massive financial penalties. Justin finally understood that the $5 million predatory loan he had illegally obtained by committing federal bank fraud was completely, utterly useless. The shadow lenders would freeze everything the moment the massive default was triggered by the primary creditor. I was that primary creditor. I was the architect of his absolute permanent destruction. I sat perfectly still in my chair watching the entire universe collapse squarely onto his shoulders. The heavy mahogany table seemed to stretch for miles, separating two completely different realities. On my side, there was only the quiet, steady peace of a man who had meticulously balanced the scales of justice. On their side, there was a rapidly accelerating descent into total, absolute madness. Valerie leaned over and snatched the paper from the table. She read the bold black ink and let out a sharp, terrified gasp. Her perfectly manicured hands crumpled the edges of the document as the brutal reality of their situation crashed down upon her. She looked at her brother with a gaze filled with pure, venomous hatred. She realized that Justin's brilliant master plan had just condemned them to a lifetime of inescapable, crushing poverty and likely federal prison. Monica began to sob quietly in the corner, burying her face in her trembling hands. The grand, luxurious life she had envisioned just moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by the horrifying prospect of criminal investigations and total bankruptcy. Mr. Wallace sat silently beside me, radiating a deep, profound, professional satisfaction. He snapped the brass latches of his leather briefcase shut. The sharp, metallic sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent, terrifying room. Justin remained frozen in his plush executive chair, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. His arrogant empire had been entirely dismantled not by a loud, violent confrontation, but by a few quiet strokes of a brass pen and a single sheet of paper. He had demanded my absolute surrender, and I had willingly given it to him. I had surrendered an empty sinking ship and allowed him to chain himself directly to the heavy steel anchor. I looked at the three broken people and their terrified lawyer. I did not offer any words of comfort or explanation. I simply sat in the cold, sterile room and watched the devastating consequences of their own boundless greed drag them permanently into the dark abyss. The silence in the mediation room was absolute and terrifying. It was a thick, heavy quiet that settled over the polished mahogany table like a suffocating blanket. I sat perfectly still in my faded canvas jacket, watching the brutal reality slowly dawn on the faces of my arrogant enemies. I watched Justin stare blankly at the single sheet of paper resting in front of his aggressive corporate lawyer. The victorious smirk had entirely melted off his pale, exhausted face. I did not raise my voice when I finally broke the dead silence of the room. A man who holds absolute total power never needs to shout to make himself heard. I let the cold, hard truth resonate clearly through the sterile, filtered air. I looked directly into Justin's bloodshot eyes and told him he had made a catastrophic, fatal miscalculation. I explained that his entire hostile takeover was based on a massive blind assumption. He had intentionally stopped paying the monthly equipment and land leases to the anonymous holding company because he wanted to starve me out of the operational business. He had foolishly believed that blocking those massive wire transfers would secure his absolute dominance over the corporate cash flow. I told him that those specific leases were the absolute foundational lifeblood of the entire freight operation. I explained that the operational company owned absolutely zero physical assets. It did not own a single concrete pillar of the shipping warehouse. It did not own a single steel wrench in the maintenance bays. It did not own a single heavy-duty diesel engine in the entire commercial fleet. I told him that as the sole executive director of Ironclad Holdings, I was officially executing the maximum penalty clauses for his deliberate, malicious breach of contract. I watched his eyes widen in pure, unadulterated horror as my words slowly penetrated his thick, arrogant skull. I broke down the exact legal mechanics of the inescapable trap he had so eagerly walked into just moments ago. I kept my voice perfectly level as I delivered the devastating financial figures. I informed Justin and his terrified sister that the accelerated lease penalties combined with the massive breach of contract fines totaled exactly $12 million. I told them this massive, staggering sum was due immediately and payable directly to my private holding trust. I explained that the operational company he now legally and proudly owned was nothing more than a toxic, bankrupt shell. Valerie let out a sharp, ragged gasp, grasping the smooth edge of the mahogany table to keep her trembling body from collapsing out of her plush leather chair. She finally understood that the massive multi-million-dollar logistics empire they had stolen was completely worthless, but I was not finished dismantling their pathetic, arrogant illusions. I turned my attention to the massive predatory loan Justin had desperately secured to fund his ruthless corporate warfare. I calmly explained that I knew absolutely everything about the shadow lenders he had used. I knew all about the $5 million he had illegally borrowed, using his mother's private estate as fraudulent collateral. I watched his jaw drop in absolute panic as I revealed my final, undeniable masterstroke. I told Justin that I had executed a highly secure, blind offshore wire transfer yesterday afternoon. I informed him that Ironclad Holdings had purchased that specific high-risk debt portfolio in its entirety. I was now the sole primary owner of the lien against the family home. He had committed federal bank fraud to obtain a loan from ruthless shadow creditors, only to discover that I was the ultimate shadow creditor pulling the invisible strings. The sheer profound magnitude of their total absolute ruin finally settled over the cold room. I laid out their exact current reality in simple, brutal, and undeniable terms. I told Justin and Valerie they were now personally and legally liable for $17 million in immediate toxic debt. I watched the blood completely drain from their faces, leaving them looking like hollow, fragile porcelain statues. Mr. Blackwood, the highly aggressive corporate shark who had strutted into the room just an hour ago, realized his wealthy clients were entirely, irrevocably doomed. He recognized that there was absolutely no legal defense against the ironclad contracts Justin had just willingly, eagerly signed. Blackwood knew his arrogant clients now possessed zero liquid capital to pay his exorbitant luxury legal fees. He also realized that Justin had committed massive federal bank fraud, and Blackwood wanted absolutely nothing to do with a criminal investigation. He stood up from his leather chair without uttering a single word of comfort or professional advice. He simply gathered his thick, useless legal files and snapped the brass latches of his expensive leather briefcase shut. He turned his back on Justin and Valerie and walked quickly out of the mediation room, entirely abandoning them to the slaughter. The loud, sharp sound of the heavy wooden door clicking shut behind the fleeing lawyer shattered the last remaining fragment of their false reality. Monica realized with terrifying clarity that she had tied herself to a broken man who was facing massive federal fraud charges and a lifetime of inescapable, crushing poverty. She did not hesitate for a single second to save herself. She stood up so fast her heavy leather chair crashed backward onto the soft carpeted floor. She ran blindly toward the exit, her expensive designer heels clicking frantically against the floorboards. She fled out into the long courthouse corridor, completely abandoning Justin without a single backward glance or word of farewell. Valerie buried her face in her trembling hands and began to sob uncontrollably. The harsh, ugly sounds of her absolute despair echoed loudly off the sterile white walls. She cried for the luxury vehicles, the exclusive designer clothes, and the elite high society status she had just permanently, irretrievably lost. She knew she would be spending the rest of her miserable life working a menial job just to pay off the massive crushing debts she had arrogantly inherited. Justin slowly slid out of his plush executive chair and sank heavily down onto his knees on the carpeted floor. The arrogant, victorious king was completely and utterly broken. He looked up at me with hot tears streaming down his pale, exhausted face. He clasped his trembling hands together and begged me to tear up the signed surrender documents. He pleaded for my mercy, promising to leave the city and never bother me again. He begged me to unfreeze his bank accounts and save him from federal prison. He offered to return the operational company and apologize publicly to the entire logistics staff. He sobbed pathetically, apologizing for his ruthless actions and his vile threats against his own mother's medical legacy. He was entirely stripped of his false bravado, reduced to a weeping, terrified shell of a man kneeling at the feet of the specific person he had tried so desperately to destroy. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or remorse as I looked down at the weeping, broken man. I had endured their endless cruelty, their vile, vicious insults, and their disgusting, unhinged threats against Evelyn's pristine, charitable legacy. I slowly stood up from my chair and smoothed the front of my faded flannel jacket. I looked at Justin kneeling pathetically on the floor in his expensive, ruined, tailored suit. I spoke to him one final time, delivering a message of absolute finality. I told him that he had desperately wanted the shipping empire, and now he possessed the absolute entirety of it. I turned my back on the weeping siblings and walked calmly toward the exit, with Mr. Wallace right beside me. I pushed the heavy mahogany doors open and stepped out into the wide corridor, leaving their pathetic, desperate sobs trapped inside the mediation room forever. I walked down the grand marble steps of the county courthouse and pushed through the heavy front glass entrance doors. The gray, overcast sky had finally cleared away entirely. I stepped out into the bright, crisp afternoon sunlight, taking a long, deep breath of the fresh, clean air. The heavy, toxic, emotional burden I had carried for weeks was completely and permanently gone. I walked across the damp pavement toward my rusted old truck. I climbed inside the worn cabin and turned the ignition key. The old engine roared to life with a steady, powerful, reliable rhythm. I drove away from the towering marble courthouse, leaving the total, absolute wreckage of Justin's arrogance far behind me in the dust. I navigated the busy city streets, steering the truck steadily back toward the sprawling industrial logistics district. I drove through the massive open steel gates of the main commercial shipping yard. The expansive concrete lot was no longer empty and deserted. My most loyal senior foreman and the veteran heavy diesel fleet managers were already waiting for me, standing proudly outside the main central maintenance bay, They had received my secure encrypted message early that morning. They knew the silent, bitter war was finally over, and the true absolute owner had returned to reclaim the working yard. I stepped out of my truck and walked toward my loyal men, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of genuine homecoming. We gathered together in the crisp sunlight and watched as the massive heavy-duty wreckers began pulling the old corporate Pierce Midwest signage down from the brick warehouse walls. We prepared to officially transfer the entire massive diesel fleet under the new protective banner of the Ironclad Holding Company. The toxic entitled parasites who had tried so desperately to drain the absolute lifeblood of our hard work had been completely permanently excised from our world. Evelyn's beautiful, charitable legacy was completely safe from their greedy, destructive hands. I stood in the center of the bustling, busy shipping yard, listening to the loud, powerful rumble of the massive diesel engines starting up all around me. I looked up at the clear, bright blue sky and smiled a genuine smile. I was finally, truly at absolute peace. The profound lesson learned from this extensive, bitter conflict is that true absolute power never requires loud, arrogant boasting or cheap physical intimidation to prove its immense validity. Real, enduring strength relies entirely on infinite patience, meticulous strategic planning, and a deep, unyielding understanding of fundamental reality. Arrogance will always blind greedy individuals to the devastating traps they eagerly build for themselves. When forced to confront profound, malicious betrayal, a person must never surrender their quiet dignity, but instead use the very mechanisms of their enemy's arrogance to restore natural order and protect their ultimate legacy. If you found this story of silent, meticulous retribution compelling, please share your thoughts below and subscribe for more narratives detailing the ultimate triumph of quiet, strategic patience.